Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, Investigating and Prosecuting Trafficking in Illicit Massage Businesses, Investigative Strategy, Part 2. My name is Emily Thresh, and I am the project coordinator here at AEquitas, the Prosecutor's Resource on Violence Against Women, and I will be moderating today's webinar. This presentation will provide practical investigative strategies to build successful prosecutions of the owners, operators, and accomplices of illicit massage businesses, or IMBs. The presenters will discuss enhancing investigations through partnerships with civil and criminal allied investigative agencies and service providers, and it will provide an analytical framework for developing investigative strategies designed to identify and preserve the evidence supporting a wide range of charges that can be prosecuted with or without victim participation. It's part 2 of a 3-part series, and you can find the part 1 on our website, and we'll have more details following on part 3. Before we begin the substantive portion of our program, I'll provide a few logistical notes. If you have any technical difficulties, please connect iLink directly at 1-800-799-4510. If you're using the internet audio option, we do recommend you dialing in with a phone since the connections are often more reliable. And I have the conference line number in the public chat section so that if you are disconnected, you can have it visible. Throughout the presentation, if you're unclear about anything or you'd like clarification, you can use the iLink hand raise indicator, which is located on the toolbar at the top left-hand portion of your screen above the presenter's photo. You can also chat me your questions using the private chat function on the left-hand side of your screen below the attendee list. I will share your questions with the presenters so they can be addressed either during the webinar or followed up after the webinar is over. Today's webinar is hosted by AEquitas, the Prosecutor's Resource on Violence Against Women, and Polaris, through the funding from U.S. Department of Justice Office on Violence Against Women. Written materials, including a copy of the PowerPoint presentation and the presenters' biographies, will be emailed to you after the presentation. And if you're calling in, just email me at the end of the presentation to get these handouts as well. We are recording this webinar so that you can view it later or share with your colleagues. AEquitas' mission is to improve the quality of justice in sexual violence, intimate partner violence, stalking, and human trafficking cases by developing, evaluating, and refining prosecution practices that increase victim safety and offender accountability. AEquitas staff conduct legal research, provide 24/7 case consultation. We host specialized or state-specific training events and webinars, provide individual experts to jurisdictions and organizations, and publish resources on topics relevant to the prosecution of violence against women. The individualized assistance AEquitas provides is data-driven and incorporates customized strategies that are easy to implement, resulting in prosecutors' ability to sustain effective practices and promote systemic change. Polaris is a leader in the global fight to eradicate modern slavery. Named after the North Star that guided slaves to freedom in the U.S., Polaris systemically disrupts the human trafficking networks that rob human beings of their lives and their freedom. Their comprehensive model puts victims at the center of what they do, helping survivors restore their freedom, preventing more victims, and leveraging data and technology to pursue traffickers wherever they operate. Today's presenters are Jane Anderson, Attorney Advisor here at AEquitas, and Oriene Shin, Strategic Initiatives Specialist at Polaris. Prior to joining AEquitas, Jane served as an Assistant State Attorney with Florida's 11th Judicial Circuit in Miami-Dade County. She spent her career handling domestic violence, sexual assault, homicide, and human trafficking cases. As a founding member of the Human Trafficking Unit and as a prosecutor of many of the state's first trafficking cases, Jane recognizes the need to build a coordinated network of allied professionals whose cooperation greatly enhances victim safety and offender accountability. Additionally, Jane has focused on the cyber investigative techniques to identify, preserve, and present digital evidence at trial. Jane is based out of the San Francisco Bay Area. Oriene Shin is the Strategic Initiative Specialist at Polaris, where she works with key stakeholders across the country to address types of human trafficking and protect human trafficking victims in their community. She also reviews and analyzes policies, regulations, and state and local level laws and regulations to better identify and recommend promising practices to stakeholders. And we also want to acknowledge Brad Myles, the CEO of Polaris, who contributed to this project but cannot join us for today's webinar. The full biographies for Jane and Oriene will be emailed to you following the webinar, along with a PDF of today's presentation slides. So I now want to turn it over to Jane for the substantive portion of today's presentation.
Thank you so much, Emily. Again, this is Jane Anderson, and I will start with recapping a little bit of what we covered in the first part of this 3-part webinar series. Those of you that haven't had a chance to view it, it is available online, and it really did provide the foundation information that we're going to use today and build upon. So we covered how illicit massage businesses are often a larger part of an organized network of criminal activity. We talked about the harms that are suffered upon the women that are working in these massage businesses. And then we talked about how traditional investigations that have been used for years to try to sort of disrupt these networks have really failed, and that we need to acknowledge, we need to look at this differently and go forward with perhaps a different strategy. So that's what we'll talk about today. Our objectives are really to, for you individually, look within your jurisdictions and think about who you can partner with that will enhance your response to this. So who are those allied professionals that can support the victims that will be brought from the cases, and also to sort of strengthen the cases and the response. We'll talk about how we can look for the different partners that may exist. We also want to go ahead and develop investigative strategies. We're going to try to present a pretty detailed investigative sort of blueprint for you so that we can go ahead and hold these offenders accountable for the full extent of their criminal activity, and maybe not focus so much on maybe the obvious prostitution-related charges or human trafficking charges, but open our minds to prosecuting some other maybe financial or immigration-related crimes. And we'll talk about how when these investigations are conducted in a detailed way, we can really lead to successful prosecutions. And those prosecutions can be successful in many cases, even where victims are really unable to participate in the process. So partnering with allied professionals, what does that mean, and who are we talking about? So this multidisciplinary approach really keeps us victim-centered, realizing that everything we do will be affecting the victim in some way or another. But surrounding the victim, there are all of these partners that can work together to successfully combat the illicit businesses that are going on. So first and foremost, we've got our law enforcement and our prosecutors. That's probably many of you on the line. But we also have medical service providers that are going to help heal and support the victims of these businesses, advocates, confidential or government employed. We also have a variety of government agencies. I'll go into more detail of who those might be. Civil lawyers that are either helping victims out with criminal charges, expungements of prior criminal charges, perhaps immigration concerns, and also perhaps civil cases against their exploiters. And we also have code enforcement, and that'll play a big piece in this so as we go through. So service provision, what are we talking about in that case? Well, to break it down just a little bit, and this is by no means an exhaustive list, but we really need to think about both immediate and long-term needs of victims that are going to be pulled out of both their work and most likely their living situations when we are shutting down and disrupting these networks. And so we're looking at things as simple as clothing and food and toiletries, but also legal service provisions and financial and translation, and really like true language access on the long term as well. So that's not just using your Google app on your phone, but really presenting the victims with true access to languages that are culturally competent for them. We also have to think about job placement and job training, therapy for those unique harms that we know are affecting the victims of this type of work. So who are our investigative partners? Okay, so we have our local, county, state police, our local, state, and federal prosecutors. We also have FBI, HSI, the IRS, the Department of Labor, EEOC, health code investigators, licensing authorities, and banking and financial institutions. And again, there's probably many more out there that I haven't yet thought of. But I do want to acknowledge that while we put together this information, I was lucky enough to have input from members of pretty much each one of these agencies who helped sort of flesh out exactly what their role might be in a successful investigation into IMB. So what is true partnership? And I really put this down as true partnership because I don't want the word to just sort of be out there as one of those things that we say, oh, we're coordinated, we're cooperative, we're partnering. What does true partnership mean? It really does mean this truly working together, that they're helping each other, not just one member helping another member. So, for example, code enforcement. This isn't just something that we partner with, air quotes, so that we can gain access to these businesses. True partnership means that we are also providing them information so that they can do their job better and fulfill what their mission is. We want to be sharing information. We want to be supporting each other financially with, bodies, surveillance, equipment, every type of support you can think of. And that also means that everybody in this partnership be involved in the planning of any operation, and that they should be coordinating together. And you'll see how that interplays with sometimes when there are concurrent jurisdictions going on, concurrent investigations going on, people are going to have different roles and different responsibilities. Sometimes there are going to be differences in confidentiality rules, and I think we'll talk about that a little bit when I go into the EEOC's role. So one of the examples of something that's worked very successfully is something that is referred to as fusion centers. And these were developed in response to 9/11, and they are physical centers where there are, physical bodies from every different agency working together in the same room, sharing information day in and day out. So if somebody gets a call from one of their colleagues, their local police, and they're like, hey, we heard about this place on, 4th Street. What do you guys know about it? You've got a room full of people that are instantaneously sharing information. So that's kind of an aspirational goal for what a task force and partnership should look like. But it's really successful. So if possible, that could be a model to look towards. There's challenges because we're going to have de-confliction issues, confidentiality concerns, disclosure restraints, and, of course, funding those full-time bodies to sit in the center. But don't let that discourage you. I'll talk a little bit about confidentiality concerns. So one of the things that comes up is that, for example, the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, they have written into their rules and regulations that they cannot disclose even the existence of an investigation. So that's probably very different from what law enforcement is able to do, that may send out press releases or ask the public for information about an ongoing investigation. So that confidentiality difference and the rules that the EEOC play by versus local police are different. So that needs to be a conversation that's had ahead of time, and that is part of what true partnership is about, is sharing that. So Oriene, do you want to go ahead and talk about the Polaris initiative?
Sure. And so at Polaris, the End Trafficking and Illicit Massage Businesses initiative is the first of its kind here as we are continuing to collect data from the NHTRC hotline. We are learning that human trafficking is just not one catch-all crime rather than a crime that has many subtypes. And so I would like to present to you the initiative that I've been working on for the last 8 months and will be for the next 18 to 36. And so the End Trafficking and Illicit Massage Businesses, or End Trafficking and IMBs, we seek to advocate for and foster a holistic, victim-centric, and sustainable approach that creates a safety net for women and dismantles the criminal networks through collaboration and partnership with stakeholders. So just to really emphasize the need for partnership and the reasons why we have this webinar for you all is really just to begin the relationships, begin to foster this idea of creating our own network to really dismantle these networks nationally. The initiative has 4 principles. We've crafted 4 principles that we really do think all of our partners should agree to and help us to strive for. So the first is to eliminate the criminal networks and permanently close down the illicit massage business networks. So really to identify not just the one brick and mortar IMB or another one over here and another one there, but to really begin to understand the network and how these IMBs are really connected whether it's by a single person or an LLC, and I'll go into a little bit more of that later in this presentation. The next is to really begin to utilize a wide range of investigative and prosecutorial tools to target these networks. So again, not just to go after those prostitution charges, but really to think about maybe racketeering or other financial or money-related crimes that we have seen to be successful strategies in certain locations across the country. The third is to really remember to treat the survivors as victims of crime and abuse, and to connect them to the service providers area or wherever the victims feel comfortable, or in an area where the victims feel very comfortable in. And so Polaris is all about the victim. We are a victim-centric nonprofit here, and this is probably one of the most important things that we love to highlight for all of our partners. And fourth, engage with the professional massage industry for the expertise and partnership. The individuals who make up the professional massage industry are a great resource for anyone to really tap into and to really understand where certain investigative strategies might be overburdensome or tactics, or maybe just to better understand the lay of the land. And so these are the four principles that the initiative have, and we ask partners to strive for and agree to. Next, the initiative is really based off of the systemic change through a holistic approach. So really going after the multifaceted approach, going after the networks, using various investigative and prosecutorial tools, but also to create this victim safety net. So it's really, we're looking at two sides of the same coin when we're talking about eradicating human trafficking from these places. We are striving for all of our partners to really start moving away from these whack-a-mole approaches and to, again, work on comprehensive investigations. Next, so how do we go about the city multifaceted approach? We think of it really as a state will and city skill. We want the entire state where you reside in to really be in support of this initiative, and then we understand that the best effect that we can have right now is to really start to build up the skill of the local prosecutors and law enforcement investigators to really understand and how to better investigate and prosecute these cases at a local level. The victim safety net, again, is critical for our victim-centric approach, and it really is about creating a strong system of service providers and other necessary individuals to ensure the healing and empowerment of the women. So we want to make sure that once these women come out of these trafficking situations in illicit massage businesses, that they have a place, that they have a safety net to fall back on and to really rebuild their lives and begin the healing process. And so I've been talking about a partnership with Polaris, and what does that mean? We really ask partners to agree to the initiative principles, the four that I laid out just a couple minutes ago, really begin to open up a dialogue with us here, regular communication, let us know if there are any new tactics or investigative strategies that you've tried out and found to be successful, and we would do the same. We would provide the same kind of communication. If you asked us any questions, we'll do our best to either answer or connect you to somebody in another city or state that might have an answer for you, as well as all of this is really to build up a collection of best practices and lessons learned to share with the rest of this network. And so what my team can really provide for everyone across the country, all of our partners, is resources. We are working very hard right now to create these case studies of promising practices as well as lessons learned, because we find that it's not just about highlighting the successes, but also to learn from what might not have worked in the past, as well as creating various different types of informational documents that we hope you can take out into the field to better understand and learn about illicit massage businesses and these networks. And coming in at the end of by the end of 2016, we hope to create this interactive online learning portal, which we're envisioning to be a centralized electronic hub for partners to access resources and peers from across the country. And so this learning portal, it would be a secure website where you would log in and you would have access to all of these different resources and case studies that we are currently creating and polishing up for you, as well as creating a forum for partners from the West Coast, East Coast, Midwest, South, Northwest to all come together and see if we can solve problems or see if somebody's had experiences with an issue another city's come across. And so these are the really big things that we are providing or hoping to provide in the next 6 to 8 months or so. And if you have any questions, please let me know. I would love to talk to any and all of you after this webinar. Thank you.
Thanks, Oriene. So criminal activity within the massage businesses. We've talked about looking away from the prostitution-related crimes, and even sometimes I would say human trafficking, even though I think that's the title of the webinar, to what else can we do? What else can we prosecute? So this is, again, just a touch of this, but we've identified some state crimes that you might want to look at, which include, of course, human trafficking, but also include things like false imprisonment, money laundering, fraud, state tax and insurance crimes. Again, there are still prostitution-related crimes that you will want to charge the business owners and operators, not the women, but you might have some laws against brothels or promoting prostitution or deriving support from the proceeds of prostitution. It looks a little different jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Also, I did want to note and thank Tabitha for bringing this to my attention, but practicing without a license, that is referring to massage licenses, and that is a felony in New York, and it's being used in New York to sort of try to leverage women to maybe being more cooperative by having more serious crimes charged. So I would discourage that practice, but you may want to think about that same type of crime and see if you can apply that to the owners and operators of these businesses. On federal and immigration crimes, we have those sort of trafficking type crimes, including forced labor, peonage, involuntary servitude, but also look for things like smuggling, visa fraud, harboring, transporting, and concealing unauthorized aliens when the victims in these cases are not documented. We also have residency for commercial advantage and private financial gain, that again on the immigration criminal side. Money laundering, Mann Act, which is sort of the federal version of a pimping statute, if I can simplify it like that. And you've got your RICO and your racketeering when you're doing that investigation on a real broad, taking a broad look at it and really disrupting the networks. That's probably going to be a very appropriate charge to look into. Now we have some other federal violations, and many of these agencies, I'll note, have state counterparts. So the Department of Labor, yes, there's a federal Department of Labor, but most states are also going to have their own Department of Labor. So you can look at both of those as we go through. So the Department of Labor really goes to the Fair Labor Standards Act. They can charge sort of civil crimes that include false statements on documents, but really where they come in to a lot of help is that the Department of Labor will calculate back wages for employees. So in these cases, you may really be looking at them more as a labor trafficking rather than sex trafficking. Either way, the victims really should be, they should have a right to restitution. And whether that's through the criminal process of restitution, which would be great, but think about the other ways you can get that sort of restitution or those civil remedies to your victims. And that may include a back wages claim by the Department of Labor. It also could be through the EEOC. They have access to civil remedies, and they have a long track record of being really successful in charging companies and individuals with sort of labor trafficking related crimes in a different way. They go after it civilly, in particular this sexual harassment under Title VII. So they have had a lot of success getting large monetary results, like upwards of millions of dollars, where victims have been sexually assaulted as part of their labor trafficking. So you'll maybe have heard of the documentary Rape in the Fields that highlights one of their cases about agricultural workers who were raped by their managers out in the field. They were able to get large civil remedies in cases like that. So just thinking about that and how that could be a partner for us, that the women, as we're talking about provision of services and all these needs that they're going to have, if they could get a direct civil remedy, and again, those that amount of money that they get awarded, that goes straight to the victim. So really think about how that could impact these cases on the long run. We're also going to have these financial crimes, and the IRS can be a great partner here because most likely we're going to look into some tax evasion, conspiracy to defraud the government, things like that. We'll also look at code violations, and a lot of you after the first part of this webinar series reached out to me and said that this was something that was going on in your communities and that your local law enforcement and code inspectors were doing a great job of passing regulations that were aimed at these sort of illicit massage businesses. So I remember in Miami while I was there, they had passed an ordinance that seemed silly that you needed to do this, but they were no longer allowed to live in the massage business. Some of the places have regulated the hours that can be kept. I was provided some sample regulations that were passed in Cummings, Georgia that were very successful from what we hear. And so if that's something that you guys are interested in, please reach out to us and we may be able to get you some sample regulations so that you and your community can look at what's being done elsewhere. And I'm glad that Oriene mentioned the legitimate massage businesses and the voice that they have. That was one of the tips that was provided to me, which was when going out and trying to figure out what regulations can really aim at the illicit massage businesses, have a conversation with the non-illicit businesses and make sure you're not making their jobs harder. They're going to have a wealth of information for you. So some of the things that we can look for are your health codes, your building codes, and then, again, these local regulations.
So developing an investigative strategy, what do we mean by this? We're talking about really going through a process and making sure that we are targeting and gathering the information on the right, on the more relevant targets and the networks, and not focusing the investigation on the victims or the women. Because again, the women we're finding in these situations as being victims and not perpetrators or criminals. And so this is the kind of strategy that we would recommend, AEquitas and Polaris, is really to identify who are your victims and who are your targets, and then from there really to begin to gather the information on the targets and the victims, and then analyze the information, develop a plan, and then consider the prosecution strategy to really start to think through these more comprehensive investigations instead of the traditional one-off undercover investigations that are occurring even to this day. The potential victims. In the first webinar, we talked a lot about who these victims are. And one of the biggest groups that we have identified here at Polaris so far has been the Asian Pacific Islander community. This is not to say that other community nationalities or communities are not involved in this network. It's just currently this is where we're seeing the bulk of the investigations and the bulk of the illicit massage businesses really being under which national origin. A lot of the victims and a lot of the targets may or may not be of a foreign-born nationality. So these are just a few of the different characteristics of the women that you might want to consider and determine when determining whether they're a victim or an operative of the network. So identify the targets. Look out for networks. Again, we are seeing more and more in our data analysis program here that these illicit massage businesses are highly networked. And when we mean network, we really are seeing them more as chains and instead of having one kingpin at the top and having like your traditional organized crime view, but really more of like chains of these networks connected by either a person or another type of data point. Identify which businesses and locations you're looking at, and identify the individuals that you are really targeting for this prosecution. And these would be owners, managers or mama-sans, associates, which could be anyone from recruiters to brokers or drivers, as well as the demand or buyers of commercial sex. The network operatives. As we had mentioned earlier in the previous webinar, the network has a lot of players. It's not just the owners and the women who create the network, but rather it is a wide range of individuals that make up this network. The sheer number of players that play a factor is incredible when you're thinking about who controls the women's movements or their psychological or physical health, which includes the loan sharks who might lend them money, to the business owners, to the recruiters who invite them to come and work in the States, to the advertisers who are really helping to create the advertisements that go out to the buyers. So I wanted to go through real quick a case study that we found just to really emphasize the amount of connectivity that we are seeing within individual IMBs within one city. And so here we're just going to call the location Midwest City. Midwest City. Here, through open source data last summer of 2015, we identified 31 illicit massage businesses or IMBs in that city. Roughly 80% were reported as open on the open source data. Through through the process that the data analysis program here has created, they had found 15 networks, which we are identifying as when there are connections between individuals or the physical addresses or another type of data, including LLC addresses or maybe even PO boxes that are used to set up the businesses. We identified 78 commercial organizations, which as you can tell, as you can see, it's not just the illicit massage businesses that we're talking about. We're finding links to non-massage commercial organizations as well. There are 84 addresses that we found connected within these networks, as well as 36 individuals. In addition, we have also found links to other U.S. states, and it's not just the neighboring states, but across the country. And this is what the map looked like when we fed all of the data that we had been able to collect through open sources, through an application that the data analysis program here uses called Palantir. And as you can tell, they're highly networked. Each of these boxes shows a network that was found in Midwest City, as well as, in Midwest City. And as you can see, it's not just one entity being its own siloed individual business or operation, but these places are highly networked and do interact with one another, whether it's through a phone number, an individual, a PO box, or the physical brick and mortar address. So to get to this, we have found a lot of information. There are a lot of sources of information that you can really look at to create these maps and to begin your investigation, your preliminary investigation, from the incorporation documents to the licenses to tax records, what police activity there could have been, social media, and all of these individual pieces of information can really begin to paint you a picture of what the IMB networks look like. Now, where to get these sources of information, from tax records to the police records or incorporations or utilities. There are many ways you can find them, from subpoenas to surveillance to search warrants, public record search, which is the method that Polaris here uses the most often, to code enforcement and online searches. And one that we would also like to highlight and ask that you don't forget about is trash. A lot of information that we've learned from other law enforcement agencies and individuals that trash that the IMBs actually throw out become a wealth of information because of the information that they're finding in there, whether it's receipts or thrown out something or different pieces of paper that have writing scribbled on it. And so all of these are key sources of information that you can use. Online, we are identifying, these are the open sources that that Polaris has used a lot of times, from the commercial sex websites or buyer review boards, from RubMaps to Backpage, to public records, Corporation Wiki, Bizipedia. These are really the public record sources that Polaris has used in the past to create our networks, as well as law enforcement activity, from news articles to court proceedings that are publicly available. Okay, and I'll have Jane go through the rest here.
I kind of touched upon this at the beginning when we talked about that idea of real partnership, but code enforcement. Identify who your local code enforcement agencies may be. Really have that conversation up front about what their mission is and how they can help in the investigation, but again, what their separate and distinct role is and what the scope of their power is. Now, also recognize the limitations of that. There's some case law out there, and again, sort of vary jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but you can't just circumvent, you can't use code enforcement to purely circumvent the requirements of the search warrant if that code enforcement is in fact not a legitimate part of their inspection power and duty. So include them as a true partner in your operations, and it can be invaluable. It also can get you a lot of other information. We gave you a very lengthy list of things that you could possibly look into in advance of any like on-the-ground investigation. And I'd encourage you guys to really take a look at each piece of information that we suggested. And every time you gather something, there's going to be even more places to look. You're going to get a new name or a new address that you'll want to do the same type of gathering of information with. The financial tools that you guys have, this is really some cool stuff, and with a lot of attention on human trafficking and the importance of having trafficking-free supply chain, we've seen a lot of financial institutions be very proactive about ensuring that trafficking isn't happening within their institution. So one of the great tools is this FinCEN, which is a part of the U.S. Department of Treasury, and they are a reporting agency that sort of oversees the Banking Secrecy Act, the suspicious activity reports, and they can also implement geographic targeting order. So basically, the BSA requires banks to report certain activity. It's a little bit subjective, and it basically gets down to the that doesn't quite look right, or that doesn't make sense. So as training is happening throughout the country with banking institutions, you're going to see that perhaps more of these suspicious reports will be flagged. And that's something that can really help us figure out who the players are, what kind of money we're talking about, build those cases against for financial crimes. Also, they can implement geographic targeting orders. And those are really specific orders that require certain businesses within a targeted area to report more activities to the to FinCEN. So if you're thinking about, hey, how can we use that in our community? Could we possibly have a geographic targeting order that required all massage businesses or bodywork businesses to report X, Y, and Z? Maybe this is a conversation that you can have with one of your partners that deals more intimately with the financial side of things. So look at the FBI, the HSI, your federal partners are probably going to be more familiar with it.
Just to wrap up the gathering information and sources of information part, I just wanted to talk to you a little bit more just to conclude with the overall findings that Polaris has found through its data analysis program and mapping of these various cities of over 10 different cities. First, locations outside of map cities. We have found that there are connections from one network or an illicit massage business that does connect out to another city or to another state entirely to law enforcement activity present. We have seen through our monitoring of news articles and criminal investigations and operations, we have seen that when there is law enforcement activity open, that there are times when we see this being reflected in the mapping where we find some of the illicit massage business locations closed. And so that we do see some of this activity present. We also find that, again, the networks are beyond just the owners and operators of the illicit massage businesses, the women and the buyers, but also include a variety of associates, including recruiters, straw men, who are individuals who the networks will put on their documentation for the businesses or licensure. Business licensure, as well as drivers, transportation between IMBs, and even between networks. We have also seen that there are a variety of businesses within the network that are not illicit massage businesses, like restaurants, travel agencies, and real estate management companies. And some of the challenges that we've also identified in mapping these is that a lot of times the record and data completeness really does depend on the city that you're looking at, because especially when you're relying on open source data like Polaris has been, we don't have access to any of the private or confidential information that state entities might have access to, and therefore we are really at the mercy of how a city or a state determines to organize their information, whether to release it, to have it accessible online, or only have it maybe in paper records. Commercial sex review validity. This is an issue that we've come across where we have heard from our partners in the professional massage industry that there are times when legitimate or professional therapists will be reviewed on commercial sex review sites, buyer review sites, as providing commercial sex acts, which is not the case, which is obviously not the case. And so this is another type of data error that we're seeing, as well as geographical scope. This is an issue that we're coming across where, because of the last bullet point, because of the because these are so time intensive when trying to map these cities out, we are only able to do a handful of cities in a long period of time, and therefore we are trying very hard to create a national scope or a national picture by only having a handful of maps created, a handful of city maps created, and so there is that difference between our information that we have been able to put together versus the national strategy that we are invoking.
So now that we've gone ahead and we've gathered this information upon information upon information, how do we go about analyzing that and really putting it into play with the next step of our investigation? So we're going to analyze the evidence, then we're going to look at a charging analysis, and then an overall analysis. So first off, analyzing the evidence. And I sort of do this literally piece by piece. Like, you pick up a piece of evidence, this utility bill. What does it tell us? Well, it tells us that it gives us a name, it gives an address, it gives us a usage of utility services, obviously, and it may also give us like a phone number. Okay, now what does this piece connect us to? Well, it connects us to the person on the utility bill, but what else should we be looking for? Well, now we've got a new phone number, and we've got to figure out who owns that phone number. Or now we've got a new address, and we've got to figure out who lives at that address, who owns that address. So, and then ask, does this piece of evidence in and of itself establish an element of the crime? So with each piece of evidence that you've gathered, you should be doing this analysis. And what you'll see is that soon enough, that network is really going to start taking form with you, and you might be a little bit inundated with a bunch of names and a bunch of addresses. And so organization will be key, one of my favorite things to tell people. So then analyze the criminal charges. Now, based on all this information you've gathered, what crimes do you, A, suspect are occurring? And we're not really talking about this point of like, what do I know I have PC for? But like, hey, what do I have a sense of, what do I suspect? So identify all those criminal charges that you can think of, and really outside of the box and the state, the federal, think about, some of the things we talked about as far as the civil remedies. Have we established something that would be able to be a civil claim against the business? Now think about all the physical evidence we have. And at this point, we really probably don't have that much testimonial evidence. So let's say we have some testimonial evidence. Maybe you have arrested some buyers, or maybe you found a prior employee who's cooperative, or whatever that be. And then list all that evidence that you have establishing for each element of the crime. So identify the charges, the elements, and then the evidence connecting you to the element. And then for each element of a charge that you cannot establish, consider what you would need and how you could get it. So here's sort of a chart that helps kind of play out what I'm talking about. Here I did a chart for human trafficking, right? So first off, we have the defendant. We've got to connect the defendant to the crime always. And then we have the element of recruiting, harboring, transporting, providing, or obtaining. And then the element of force, fraud, and coercion, and then the element of commercial sexual activity. Well, if you've had an officer go in undercover and establish that commercial sexual activity is being at least solicited within the business, we've done that a couple of times. We've been able to establish that with each and every time the solicitation occurs, that with each and every employee the solicitation occurs, then you probably, through your undercover officer, have been able to establish that last element. So you can start working on the other elements. So just kind of a framework for you to use. So the overall analysis, now that you've kind of done the evidentiary analysis, the charging analysis, overall you want to say, hey, do I have probable cause to arrest? Who do I have that made up against? Because there's going to be lots of people that we've identified. What do I have PC to arrest for? And what agency is really the best one to effectuate that arrest? Who's going to get the most out of it? You also want to analyze probable cause to search. Have you established you can search the location? If you have established that commercial sexual activity is occurring within the location, I would suggest that, yes, you have probable cause to search that location. But have you also established enough about perhaps the residence where many of the employees are being driven to and from before and after work? Because as we know, once we sort of make our investigations known, these networks are going to collapse upon themselves. They're going to shut down and they're going to move to another city or county or state. And so we will need to be as prepared up front to have this investigation sort of move into that active phase all at once. And based on a search, are you going to have further PC? Do you expect that based on the search of the location that you're going to find something that's going to give you PC for something else? Can you prepare a warrant in advance and so that you're really sort of limiting the follow-up investigation that needs to happen and you're able to do it on a smaller time frame? So develop that operational plan with your partners, right? Are you ready to make the arrest? Are you going to want to do arrest warrants? Is it going to be part of another undercover operation? Or are you going to have to establish probable cause for the arrest after something else happens, perhaps after a search warrant is executed? Can you search the location? Are we going to be able to have these warrants signed in advance and coordinated? Or are you planning on using code enforcement because you have reason to believe that perhaps there are women that are living within these establishments or whatnot? And then what is the prosecutor's role? I would suggest to you that the prosecutor's role should be very active at this point. They should be ready, prepared, fully briefed on any operation, and probably asked to have their input on that operation as well. And I know that this is going to vary by jurisdiction, but I would suggest that this is one of those types of operations where you really need to be working hand in hand so that the prosecutor can be there to approve the search warrants if that's your jurisdiction's policy, to confer immunity, to advise on legal issues. These are going to be really dynamic scenes that are going to be happening and unfolding in front of you. And so to have the prosecutor there that can help advise on the legal issues along the way would be a very big strength. And then again, who are our service providers? What services are we going to have available on the scene on that day, ready to go? And I think at the very least, we're probably going to need some language services, some housing services, and just some advocacy services someone to be there whose only job it is to be victim-centric, because that is how we do all of our work, but is not the only job that we'll have on the scene that day. So to have service providers there with that as their sole designation can be very key to the ultimate success of our operation, including the safety and well-being of the women. So prepare for the victims. Think about all the things that Oriene talked about, what we want to know up front about who these women are, what their national status, national origin is, their ages. Are any of them related to anyone else in the organization? These are all things that we want to know up front, because that gives us the ability to respond immediately to what we perceive or what we expect the situation to be. So again, language services, key right there. Can we reserve some shelter space or some hotel rooms? Or is there an independent residence that you think is safe enough for them to remain in that night? The basic necessities, have these ready to go. Donated items. A lot of people want to help with this type of work. If you talk to your community partners, charities, churches, and then also, are you going to be able to maybe let them have access to their own belongings, or is that scene going to be closed off to them? Think about that before you go in. I'd really suggest taking a serious look at providing medical care. I think, we underestimate this part of it because we're thinking as investigators and prosecutors, and we think, oh, well, there won't be any sort of like forensically valuable evidence collected. But the sexual assault nurse examinations and our medical services are not just for us to collect evidence, but they provide such a great service to the women working in these businesses who are being perpetually subjected to harm and potential health consequences. So to let them know up front that we really do care about their health and well-being can do a lot to maybe build that rapport and trust with them. And then, of course, your legal services, transportation services, relocation. These women, part of the networking is to keep them constantly isolated. They may want to be back to where they have friends or family or have some sort of more stable location. So be prepared for that. Okay, so once we've kind of done the operation, whatever that looks like, you guys have planned it in advance, been wonderfully successful. So now we've got to debrief it. Hopefully we've been able to identify who the offender is, a witness, and a victim. What crimes do we have PC for? Do we now have more evidence, whether by physical evidence we've seized or statements that we've been able to gather on the scene? Do we have more evidence of other crimes? Keep looking, keep going, because as we know with these networks, everything that we find out is going to lead us to something else or someone else. And someone, I think it's going to come up here. Yes, it is. Sorry. So very well may need to prepare additional search warrants. Did you see some digital devices? I'm going to guess you're probably going to have at least one cell phone at the end of the day. And so be prepared to search those digital devices. And one of the ways we can establish probable cause for that, think about it, does this illicit massage business also have an online advertising presence? And because of how ubiquitous our smartphones are, our laptops are, the fact that they are uploading photos and online advertisements is going to be a real big piece of how you can get into all that digital stuff, which hopefully will open up a whole other world for you to investigate. Also, you may find out about additional locations, or you may have just established probable cause at the time. So continue to work with your partners. They may end up having their own investigations that become concurrent investigations. And again, that deconfliction. If you've had those conversations up front, it's going to be much more successful when we're now in the middle and the thick of things, because you've been able to sort of have that conversation and expect what's coming. And then consider offering immunity or plea offers that include cooperation agreements. And I had a question about the mamathons, the women that often began as victims and are now serving as sort of part of management. It's very similar dynamic to what we have with bottoms in our typical sex trafficking cases. And I would put out there that that is probably the most difficult thing for a prosecutor to analyze. It incorporates so much information that we want to know. Is their management of the women, is that a survival tool that they have implemented? Is there some fraud or coercion that's going on that they're now too old to work? So if they still have a debt, they still have to they don't have to perform the sex acts anymore, but now they have to manage everybody else. So this is kind of one of those places where I would say they maybe look at giving them immunity, but in advance of that, gather as much information as you can about who that mama sana is and what their exact role is, and if they've been involved in any of the recruitment, discipline, and force, fraud, or coercion implemented on other victims. If you have any other questions about that or a case-by-case analysis, it's something that I would be more than happy to talk over with you. And then we're continuing to monitor those provisions for services. I would suggest that threatening victims with prosecution for their own crimes is just moving 2 steps backward in this direction. And we should be certifying any documents for immigration relief. So that's going to be your U visa or your T visa. And that's a whole separate presentation. And again, something that I can follow up with you on information on those 2 documents if you have questions. So as we're sort of leaving part 2 of the webinar and moving on to part 3, we want to think about our prosecution strategy. Does this operation now expand? Do we have to look for more people? Do we want to keep going? Is this a racketeering case that we are able to present now or present in peace and then continue to support and strengthen, or do we really sort of have what we need at this point? So going forward, I suggest that you all sort of take a look around your community. Who are your partners? Who are those allied professionals that may be interested in joining you in one of these, maybe a test case, maybe identify one target and go through sort of the analysis, that investigative strategy that we've laid out for you to get today. And then really think about how to form true partnerships that are going to be sustainable and help each other. Because no one likes to feel like they're being used. They want to be a piece of it, right? And sometimes it means they want to be mentioned in a press report, and sometimes it just means that they want shared information. Develop those strategic plans in advance. This is a lot of upfront work that we're asking you to do prior to going in, kind of making the bust. And it takes a little bit of a different approach, especially if you go back to, part 1 when we were talking about that whack-a-mole approach. We're saying don't arrest, be patient, collect all of this information up front, and then hopefully, with or without victim prosecution, you're going to be able to disrupt these networks. And then be prepared to support our victims in every way conceivable, from the short term to the long term, to legal matters, to language services and basic provisions. And encourage them, and I think by showing that sort of dedication to their well-being, that in and of itself supports them and perhaps can bring them to a point to be able to engage in the criminal justice system with us, which of course is what we would love. But if we can't have that because they're just not able to participate, at least we've got strong cases that are prosecutable. So part 1, again, we've talked about that. That's online. Right now, part 3 is scheduled for June 30th. I don't know if that's still tentative or not, but I think we're pretty locked down to that date. The next part is going to be talking about some interview techniques, really thinking about the trauma that's been imparted on the victims and how we can use that knowledge to help form more positive interviewing. And then trying the case, what it actually looks like to present these cases to trial. And we'll also talk about the civil and administrative proceedings that may be running concurrent to our investigation. So that's all my information. I know it's going to be provided to you. I very much encourage you to reach out to me if you ever have any questions as you're working through this, and if you or your team are interested in sort of tackling this. I know both myself and Oriene are happy to be resources to you.
Yeah, I absolutely echo Jane in every way in that. Please reach out to me whenever, or if you want to talk and schedule a time to talk more about the initiative and how you can be a part of it, because really for us, strength in number is key, where we want as many of the law enforcement prosecutors and service providers a part of this initiative so that we can really create a robust learning portal and resources for all of y'all to really latch onto and use.
So yes, thank you, Oriene. Thank you, Jane. Thank you all to the participants who were here on the call today, and for those of you who are listening to the recording, we appreciate your time. We are locked into that June 30th for the third and final part of our series, but we'll get the timing out to you all in one of our announcements. So thank you again to the presenters. Thank you for coming today, and please remember that AEquitas is a 24/7 Technical assistance provider. We're available for your questions, for your training needs, for resources, so please don't hesitate to call. You will be getting the handout from the presentation today in PDF form following the webinar, and I will also include the link to the recording so you can pass it on to colleagues if they are interested. And for those of you calling in on the conference line but maybe weren't able to connect on the internet, you can shoot me an email as well, and I would be happy to send you the materials for that. So thank you, everyone, and hope you all have a good day. Bye-bye.